My name is Alan Broadbent, and I'm chair of the Maytree Foundation, which my wife Judy and I founded about 30 years ago. And Maytree is dedicated to reducing poverty and inequality and promoting prosperity. And it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Ben Perrin to you, as well as welcoming you all. There are parts of that film which I think we all agree were very difficult to watch. And I find it abhorrent to think that this kind of exploitation is possible, not only around the world, but in our own communities. But at the same time, and particularly in that last note in the film, it gives us hope. There are a number of organizations that are fighting human trafficking, and many of you I know are involved in this work. It's inspiring to know that so many of you are not willing to turn your eyes away from the most vulnerable in our society. This problem is so clandestine, it would be easy to pretend it doesn't exist. In 2005, I was in the UK talking with my friend Barrett Mehta, CEO of the Trust for London, and he described to me some of the work that they were doing in preparation of the bicentenary of the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1807, the famous Wilberforce initiatives. While slavery was illegal when we were talking, it was still practiced in the UK and around the world, he told me, with people being forced to work under conditions of slavery, documents confiscated, threats of violence to them or their families, their liberties curtailed. They worked in the sex trade, in agriculture, in domestic service, industry, in many places hidden from view. And a short time later, I attended a session at a conference that with participants from the Helen Bamber Foundation and a representative of the UN agency working on these issues. And they described at that time not only the enormity of these problems, but also how widespread and ubiquitous they were. Maytree President Ratnam Midvar and I discussed the issue and decided we not only needed to do more about it, but we needed to do something about it. And our investigation into how we might go about doing this led us to Ben Perrin and his work. We met Ben in 2007, and he'd already, as you can see from the film, had already been working on this issue for a number of years. Just out of law school, as you saw, Ben traveled to Cambodia, where he saw firsthand the images portrayed. To respond to this, he founded the organization called the Futures Group, which continues to fight human trafficking around the world. In Canada, Ben has been a policy advisor for the Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration, where he was instrumental in the creation of the temporary resident permit, which allows international victims of human trafficking to remain in the country while the criminals who exploited them are prosecuted. More recently, he worked closely with MP Joy Smith, who was able to pass a private member's bill creating mandatory sentences for criminals involved in human trafficking. He has participated in numerous parliamentary committees and has become a frequent commentator in the media on this issue. And as I think you know, Ben is a member of the UBC Law faculty. In 2009, Ben was honored by Hillary Clinton and the U.S. State Department as a hero acting to end modern-day slavery, and he is the first Canadian to be recognized by this award. Without being equipped by the facts, we'll never be able to confront this hidden national tragedy. Invisible Change is based on 3 years of research, involving dozens of researchers working with Ben, interviews with people working on these cases across Canada, accounts of survivors, and thousands of pages of government records obtained through the Access to Information Act. The book went on sale last week and is already in the top 50 of Canadian book sales on Amazon.com. And Ben is donating a portion of his book sales to organizations that support the victims of human trafficking. So if the message is not too subtle for you, buy the book. I'd like to welcome Benjamin Perrin to the stage, thank him for his work, and congratulate him on the book. Ben?
Thank you all for coming tonight. I know that there are a lot of people in the room who've been touched very personally by this issue, and I mean, I can only try to imagine how tough it was to see some of that footage. And I think it's important that people hear from survivors themselves about this issue, and that's why I've tried as much as possible to let their voices speak in this book. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of pages in my book you'll find with survivors giving their stories. One of the reasons for that is their traffickers are still at large. The vast majority of convicted human traffickers in Canada are serving minimal jail terms. Most individuals who commit this crime go unpunished. And I've been trying to understand why that is and how we can allow this to continue to happen in our country. So you'll see this part up here. This is the banner we came up with. Now, the get informed part, I have to say, is the easy part. You're all here tonight, so you're going to be informed. This is the tough part, the be inspired part. We put this up here before I had even thought about what I was going to say tonight. And the reason I did that is because that's really the challenge we have. The challenge is to overcome the sense of desperation, malaise, depression, that the problem is so big we could never do anything about it, to give you some concrete tools when you go away tonight to think about what you can do in your own circle of influence. And that's why those little postcards are here. So I encourage you to take one of those home. If there's one next to you that someone hasn't taken, it's got a list of things, 10 things that you can do in your own life to combat this horrible problem. We've been extremely busy today trying to raise the issue of human trafficking onto the political agenda here in Ontario. I think it's safe to say after dozens of media interviews, a press conference at Queen's Park, getting the attention of the provincial government, we've done that now. I'm leaving tomorrow. You all are still here. I mean that quite seriously. I'm off to Montreal. We're trying to do the same thing there. The reason why there are so many local organizations here tonight is for you to connect with them directly. The reason there's an appendix in the back of the book is so you don't have to email me saying, hey, I heard about this group, how do I contact them? It's all in the back of the book. So that's the whole purpose behind this initiative, is to inform Canadians about modern-day slavery that's happening in our communities. I'm going to get really specific about where that is in just a moment. Okay? And I want to encourage you, as I'm going through the talk tonight and talking to you about some of the raw facts and statistics, but also the cases in the Greater Toronto Area, to let you know that at the end of this talk, I'm going to let you know who some of the heroes are who are working on this issue in the community. And it's important for them to know that they have your support, and for them to know how important there is moving forward, because after 10 years of working on this issue, the only way that I have continued to do this work is because of the survivors that I've worked with. It's the young survivors, the adults who have overcome this sort of horrible adversity and are so strong-spirited that they are moving on with their lives. Something that's just been amazing for me is to see the career choices that survivors of human trafficking have made. Some of you, as you read through the book, are going to wonder what happened to some of these victims, and whenever I know, I tell you about it. It's remarkable how many of them, even a young woman who was found in Alberta, she was kidnapped out of an orphanage. You know, we thought it just happened in the movies. This is a confirmed case in Alberta at 9 years old in the post-Soviet Ukraine. For 2 decades, from age 9 until her 30s, she was sold for sex on 3 continents. She eventually is brought to Edmonton, is sold for sex there. We have long-term victims of sex trafficking brought to Canada in order to make greater profits because Canadian men are willing to pay for them. Now, what happened to her is eventually, because no one identified her or rescued her in that whole 20-year period, she was eventually disposed of. Right? These people, as we say, are treated like property. She was left outside a hospital in Edmonton. She was so deeply and profoundly psychologically and physically affected by all of this abuse that she was no longer of any value. No one would ever pay to continue to abuse her. She's on the road to recovery now. So we can keep thinking about those horrible 20 years, or we can think about what she's doing now. And what she's decided to do with her life after she's got counseling, after she's learned English, is she wants to be a nurse. This is the first choice in her adult life, and it's to help others. It's pretty inspiring. And that's why the second message is to be inspired. Because if these survivors have the courage to move on, surely we have a duty to help them. Now, how can we do it? Well, I'm going to start out with the be informed part. First of all, what is human trafficking? Well, It's something you often read in media articles saying, well, no one really agrees what human trafficking is. They used to say that, and I always kind of correct them. You can now too, by the way, in letters to the editor, right? Don't leave it all to the organizations in the room. There actually is a common definition. It's in the first chapter of this book. Over 115 countries agree on it. Okay? Human trafficking is using methods like deception, trickery, force, fraud, coercion to cause someone to be sold for either sex acts or enforced labor. I know some of you in the room are from the Greater Toronto area, some of you live in Hamilton. How many of you are familiar with the case in Hamilton that I'm talking about right now? The largest human trafficking bust in Canadian history just happened on Friday. We, of course, planned that to coincide with the launch of the book. And this is a case that the RCMP have been working on for over 10 months. The reason why people who are activists in this area get excited about this sort of thing is not because of the horror of the cases. It's because we know they're happening every day and they're not being found. So cases that are reported mean traffickers being arrested and victims being given a new chance. That's why it's a cause for celebration when these cases happen. For those of you who aren't familiar with the case, 19 men from Hungary. Human trafficking keeps defying all the misconceptions I ever had. Men, 1 in 4 foreign trafficking victims in Canada today are men. These men were brought to Canada legally. They believed they would be working in the construction industry. And instead, when they're brought here, they're locked in a basement. They're fed food scraps only once a day. They're not allowed to associate with anyone else. Not only do the traffickers have the audacity to take the proceeds that they earn through their construction jobs, they also had them file fraudulent refugee claims and seek social security benefits. Talk about double dipping. Okay? The audacity of traffickers in Canada knows no bounds. And the reason I suggest to you they have this audacity is they know the chances of being caught are infinitesimal. One trafficker in Peel Region, and we have some people I consider heroes here tonight from the Peel Regional Police, a police force you should be proud of. They're leading the country in combating sex trafficking. I hope you don't get tired of clapping because, like I said, there are heroes, okay? Those police supported by Crown prosecutors who get it. Now, I know for a fact one of the Crown prosecutors, when they got the first Peel case, said, where's the cargo container ship? Right? The same misconceptions that even I had. Okay? So it's all about educating ourselves. The audacity of some of the traffickers in Peel Region include things like the following. One trafficker would fine his Canadian victim if she did not have a fresh pot of coffee ready for him when he arrived. He added that to the so-called exit fee she owed. Okay. Another trafficker here in the Greater Toronto area, an alleged trafficker, had the audacity to essentially arrange for the kidnapping of a toddler in order to keep this young immigrant mother from Haiti being compliant and selling her for sex out of a Downsview apartment. There are neighbors. How many of you live in condos or apartment buildings? Just raise your hand. I do. I live in a really tiny one in Vancouver. You've got neighbors to your sides, up and down. I play the music a little loud. I get a knock on the door. Okay? These traffickers had the audacity to assault this woman in a condominium, selling her with streams of men coming through, this young mother from Haiti. Okay? So when I say that human trafficking is in our community, it's embedded in our communities. We call these things micro brothels. Okay? And they're prevalent throughout major Canadian cities. So human trafficking has this common definition of force, fraud, or coercion to subject someone to sexual exploitation or forced labor. The other thing this UN treaty from 2000 does is it commits countries, including Canada, to prosecute traffickers, make it a crime and prosecute them. We had to wait 5 years to have a crime of human trafficking in Canada. Why is it in the news so much? Because it's only now that it's becoming adopted in certain regions that they even look at this as a charge. Manitoba had its first human trafficking charges just last month. Let's blow another myth out of the water. The trafficker was a woman, trolling through women's shelters. It's not the first time. It's also happened in Ottawa, the first convicted female trafficker going to women's shelters. Okay. So again, it's continuing to defy our myths. I want to give you a few key facts, okay? And then we'll get into some of the cases and what we can do here in Ontario to better combat the problem. Based on this 3-year research that I undertook, I can tell you that human trafficking is happening in every major region of Canada. We've documented cases from Victoria and Vancouver, Calgary and Edmonton, Saskatoon and Winnipeg, Toronto, Ottawa, Niagara region, Halton, Peel. The list goes on and on all the way up to Halifax. Okay, so it's happening across the country. We also know that both sex trafficking and forced labor trafficking are happening. The victims, as I've said already, are not just Canadians and immigrants, but they also include women, children, men. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of victims of human trafficking exploited every year in Canada. It's why Alan used the term it being a hidden national tragedy. Now, in terms of the breakdowns of exploitation, it was interesting when we looked at the cases and found that there's actually a roughly equal number of cases, at least those that are known to the Federal Immigration Department, of sex trafficking versus forced labor in construction, live-in caregivers, some of these including children as young as 13 brought to Canada to be babysitters, forced labor by day, servants essentially, and by night abused sexually by the men of the home. They're both a forced labor and a sex trafficking victim at the same time. We've been able through our research to pinpoint the top 4 foreign countries where victims are brought from: China, the Philippines, Romania, and Moldova. What do those 4 countries share? They've all failed to meet the minimum standards to combat human trafficking. They either punish victims when they come home, with imprisonment in some cases, or they're complicit in the crime and are on the take. Now, in terms of the foreign sex trafficking cases, we've seen two very extreme varieties. Okay? One includes that young woman from the Ukraine that I mentioned. In the book, I call her Katya. Everyone has a pseudonym in the book, except for me and the police officers and others involved. She's someone who's a long-term victim brought to Canada, and we would consider her a modern-day slave. There are also women who are recruited from other countries deliberately by traffickers, and these women are already being prostituted in their home countries. They're offered to come to Canada, work in a nice area of town, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. They then owe a debt when they get here. That debt is, of course, inflated. They add and bill back absolutely everything imaginable, charge exorbitant interest rates, and that victim is no longer able to leave. They cannot stop being sold. Okay. That's called debt bondage, and it's been around for thousands of years. International law considers it a practice similar to slavery. And we've heard of false offers of employment. I can tell you that we have cases documented, including in Ontario alone, where victims of human trafficking have been sold in every single outlet that you can think of for the sex trade. Micro brothels, like I mentioned, out of escort agencies. 15-year-old Chinese girl sold out of an escort agency that I talk about in the book. Massage parlors. You've heard about Craigslist. I'm going to get back to them in a minute. And I want to read you something that the Canada Revenue Agency analyst who looked at the contracts of exotic dancers brought to Canada said. She reviewed the clauses of the contracts that are being used to bring foreign women into Canada to allow them to be sold for sex. The Canada Revenue Agency said that these contracts, quote, smack of slavery, unquote. That's their words. The reason why is that none of the money that the person supposedly earned would ever be given to them until the very end of their contract. Less, of course, disbursements, stage time, outfits, you name it. Okay? So every single outlet that we've seen has been exploited by sex traffickers. And I think that's an important point as we consider how to deal with the problem. Now, I've mentioned already this case in Hamilton involving forced labor. There's a few other details from other forced labor cases that I think paint a very appalling picture that I think, quite frankly, is a stain on Canada's international reputation. These are some of the conditions that the RCMP described in an incident report that we obtained through access to information. They reported victims of forced labor sleeping on mattresses in storage rooms, never allowed to leave their place of work, forced to use garbage bins for their washing, taking their bank cards supposedly for tax purposes. These are many cases where people come to Canada, they're skilled, they have something to contribute, they're brought here, and then what happens to them is very similar to what happened to those construction workers in Hamilton. I've been arguing that we owe these people better. If someone came to Canada legally, sought to work here, is qualified to work here, and they get exploited in this fashion, why is it that we don't allow them to have alternate employment in that sector when they are able to escape these situations? So I've been calling for what we basically refer to as whistleblower protection. Give them an option when they get out of this other than returning home to their country. Right? That's going to encourage people to get out of these situations and also provide them with support to go after the lost wages that their traffickers have taken from them. Now, in terms of the Canadian victims, this is just a brief list that I came up with in looking through the book after we'd written it. And I say we because, as you know, there's a lot of people who worked on this. These are the avenues of recruitment for Canadian women and underage girls. These are people who are controlled by violent street gangs and opportunistic criminals. Girls as young as 13. These are our daughters in our community. Recruited out of group homes. Aboriginal youth shelters for sexually exploited youth. Centers for abused women. Walking home from school. The William White School in Winnipeg has a parent block watch program. This is in an area so infested by gangs, drugs, and the sex trade in Winnipeg, parents have had to walk their elementary school-aged kids to school to keep men in Winnipeg from soliciting their underage children for sex acts because the area is so well known for street-level prostitution. That's what's happening in some communities in Canada. And if you think, I don't live in that kind of community, well, we have cases in Rosedale if you'd prefer to think about that. Additionally, we have at high schools in Vancouver, where I currently live, the RCMP had to send out home a warning last year to parents about a group of former students who are now both drug and human traffickers, notice the interplay there, who are recruiting underage girls, selling them on Craigslist and using force and threats of force to control them. Shopping malls, I'm going to get back to that one in a second, bus stations, parks, and of course on the internet. That's where kids are and that's where traffickers have gone. So Facebook has been used as well as MySpace. $280,000. That's the estimated annual revenue for one Canadian girl being sold by a sex trafficker in Canada. $280,000. I went to university for an awfully long time, including this university, U of T, and I can tell you, you don't make anywhere near that legitimately going to school for 8 years. Not at least at my age, okay? And I'm still paying off those law school loans. So, U of T is a great school, but you pay for it for a long, long time. The parents in the room know that. These guys have figured it out. I'm going to talk about a case in Peel region, which I think really drives that point home in just a moment. Now, I'm not going to talk in detail about the street gangs that are active, but suffice it to say you can read about them in the book. And the one point I want to make is that I'm not the first person revealing the involvement of street gangs in this problem. In 2007, I pulled this news story off of the internet to really illustrate the point that while police have been putting out the call for action on this issue for years, no one in a position of authority in the Ontario government has done anything about it with respect to the resources that our police forces need. This is from 2007, October 25th, almost 3 years ago, later this month. GTA police seeking task force to deal with NS pimp problem. It goes on to talk about the specific street gang, and this is the quote from the Peel Regional Police at the end. Detective Randy Cowan says, I want a task force set up to clean up the problem. Here's the reason, quote, it's important to combat these street gangs on a large scale, encompassing several regions, so they don't just displace from one region to the next, because they're going to go where the money is. I can tell you that with increased enforcement of the very street gang that's been identified in this document, police forces in other parts of the country have told me during my research for this book, they have seen members of that gang in our communities in Calgary and in Vancouver. They're moving out west. They've already done it. These street gangs are so violent and have such a reputation for violence that the Calgary Police Vice Unit officers told me that other traffickers in Calgary pay this Nova Scotia-based street gang just to leave them alone. How do we expect the 13 and 14-year-old girl to stand up to a street gang like that? We need to provide them with services and support that's similar to the Witness Protection Program in many cases. That's what the Toronto Police Service Sex Crimes Unit has said. And in many cases, that's needed. And the police have been telling us for years we need a provincial task force. So I made that recommendation in February to Premier Dalton McGuinty in a face-to-face meeting. Today, I made the recommendation again publicly, and it's in the book as well, calling on the Premier to listen to what our police are telling us and protect these children in our community and announce a task force to crack down on these street gangs. The other dark side of this puzzle is the trafficking of Canadian women to the United States. I was shocked to find that this was happening. It was not just one case, but it began to grow and grow. According to the Edmonton Police, $10,000 is the cost per weekend. $10,000 per weekend is the cost that is paid for a single Canadian victim in Las Vegas. We got some more of these incident reports by the police. This is the part that was not censored. Pages and pages that are blacked out. They're actually not blacked out anymore because that looks sinister. I don't know if you watch the news anymore with the access to information filings. They used to be blacked out. And you'd have this one line and the blacked out, no, they're censoring information. Now it's very sneaky. It's all whited out. So that's just a blank page. Must have just slipped in there, you know. So just a little side comment. This is the one line or two that made it through. Described a case involving another Canadian victim. It says she was, quote, lured from Edmonton to Las Vegas, raped and beaten, then flown to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, raped and beaten again, then forced into prostitution. One line, but the suffering and the abuse behind this is heartbreaking. I talk in Invisible Chains about Jessie Foster. I hope to bring more profile to her case. Her mother has been working for years to try to bring her missing daughter home. When I first heard about Jessie's case and the facts related to it, I said this sounds like a textbook case of human trafficking. We need to have her case brought up again. It needs to get more attention. Her mother has written a letter. She wants it to be read and circulated, so I included it in the book. And you can hear from someone who's the mother of someone who's an average Canadian. This girl used to work in Boston Pizza and Kamloops. She met a man at a party, built up a relationship. He offered her a free ticket to Florida. This is the free trip to Florida scam, and it's not the first time it's happened. We have other cases here in Ontario where these American traffickers have been in shopping malls, befriended these women, and brought them down to Florida, and this began the nightmare. It's not like the Hollywood movies of abduction, although there are a few cases involving abduction in Canada that you'll have read about in the book when you do. It's the deception. It's the smooth traffickers. The best traffickers never get caught, and they're out there still. I wanted to now talk about Craigslist and then what we can do to improve the response and some of the heroes that are supporting this work in our community. You've already seen Craig Newmark's interview that was on CNN. I think for it to be called an interview, he has to answer questions, though, so I'm not sure if that qualifies or not. This is a problem in Canada. It's not simply something that we're saying me too in response to what has happened in the US. Craigslist is, in many trafficking operations, the critical part of it. Okay? It allows for victims to always be available online and yet moved constantly throughout the community. Some traffickers have something called the 10-day rule. They move their victims every 10 days so that they cannot be befriended by neighbors. If anyone calls and reports on this person, they're already gone. So Craigslist is the critical part of it. It allows them to always be online, but at the same time hidden. It's free. It's largely anonymous, although that's not entirely true, and it's brutally effective. In 2007, the Calgary police rescued a missing girl, a teenager from British Columbia. Her parents somehow found out their missing daughter was being advertised online for a sex act. That has to be every parent's worst nightmare. Fortunately, this girl was rescued by the Vice Unit. Like Vice Units in Ontario, that unit has been gutted. It's just not a priority. Right? Prostitution is the victimless crime, we're told, and therefore, why would we have a Vice Unit? These cases reveal why we need to have proper resources for police. That was a case then, like the police thought, maybe it's just one. They launched 2 undercover investigations. Operation Carmel. Over a 2-year period, the Vice Unit in Calgary arrested 30 people for facilitating criminal activity on Craigslist on the erotic services page. They rescued 3 more underage girls. They found women brought from as far away as Vancouver and Winnipeg, sold on Calgary's Craigslist site. Second undercover investigation, Operation Street Fighter. Some of the police need to tell me where you get these names from, by the way. They're great names, they're really interesting. I got a few ideas too. But Operation Street Fighter. This was into Asian organized crime. And the Calgary police found Craigslist is the medium of choice. That's the words from the report that was entered into a court in an expert's report. The medium of choice for Asian organized crime. Not one medium, the medium. Why? Everyone knows about Craigslist. Some people say if you shut down Craigslist, they'll move to other sites. There is absolutely a concern about displacement. Okay? But Craigslist is the website that the businessman knows about when he goes out of town. Okay? It's not the specialized sex service sites that are cruel, demeaning, and only really known by habitual sex act purchasers. Okay? So Craigslist is this Walmart of sex trafficking, and that's why there have been calls in the US to shut it down, and they finally succeeded last month. I'll talk about the Peel region cases in a minute, but it's a problem here in Ontario as well. Indeed, the very first trafficker that you saw convicted in Canada used Craigslist. He made $400,000 by exploiting 2 victims. One, a 14-year-old Ontario girl with fetal alcohol syndrome. How could someone be tricked into this? Well, let's begin to think about this situation. She was in child protection in a foster home in Peel Region. And this individual, Amani Nekpangi, shows up one day and offers to take her away. She believes him. He uses the tried and true tactic we've seen again and again and convinces a 14-year-old girl that someone twice her age is her boyfriend and that he will provide the first real home for her. And because she's 14, of course, she can't have her own bank account, so he's going to look after all the money. Well, that money didn't go for a fund for her own home. It went for his own personal enrichment, a BMW, a luxury home in Niagara Falls. And at the same time, this individual is exploiting someone. When he first took control of her, she was 15 and homeless. Now, the reason why this case is significant is not just because it's the first conviction for human trafficking. It shows how one trafficker can use two totally different methods of control simultaneously, whatever best suits the victim's vulnerability. So while one victim, the 14-year-old, believes this is her boyfriend, the second victim is controlled through physical violence. And when that doesn't prove to be enough, he threatens to kidnap her 3-year-old toddler brother. That's what people who practice torture do. It's an analogy which was made to me, I first heard it in the United States. People who work with long-term victims of sex trafficking, when they first started rescuing them over 10 years ago in the US, they had to bring in trauma counselors who dealt with torture victims because that's the only person that could understand the plight that they were in. And there's a table which compares these methods in the book. This is also the case which really shows how a lack of a plan in Ontario to help victims is foisting the job onto police, whose primary job is investigating cases. The Peel Regional Police are heroes, as are the organizations who are helping these victims. What they did to help these young people, Tamara Cherry, who's here tonight with Sun Media, has written about this case and met these young survivors, one of whom we call Eve. It's odd to call someone the older victim when they're only 14, when they're only 15, right? That's kind of shocking. She had the name of her trafficker tattooed on the back of her neck, marked like a piece of property. The Peel Regional Police helped her in her recovery by finding a pro bono tattoo artist to conceal that name of the trafficker in a beautiful flower design. It's a symbol of rebirth and survival, and this young woman is moving on with her life. So there is hope. But Craigslist today continues to be used for the advertising of sex services that they found in the US you could not separate by looking at these ads. Oh, well, this person is an independent escort, like this individual who's charged the laws of prostitution in Ontario. And, well, this one is a minor. And, well, this adult's a trafficking victim. No one in the room who works professionally in this field could know from a single piece of paper, a single ad online, whether or not someone's a sex trafficking victim or not. Craigslist manually screened every ad in the US for months and were unable to screen them out because it's impossible to. They haven't taken that step in Canada yet. They haven't even screened these ads. Craigslist released testimony in the US Congressional Committee last month which reveals that while their sites declined to about 10% of volume, so meaning 90% of the ads shouldn't have been on there in the first place in the US after they brought in some of these safeguards, in Canada they've refused to bring in these additional safeguards, things like credit card verification and the like, manually screening ads. What happened in Toronto? While the US cities went down to 10% of their level, the graph in Toronto shoots up to 170% in the same period. What's Craigslist doing about it? Well, this is a letter that I received today after calling on the Ontario government to stand up against Craigslist and call for them to shut down their erotic services section. Last week I was in the news calling for this to happen. I've threatened a private prosecution against Craigslist if a Crown prosecutor is unwilling to move ahead, and we're preparing a brief for Crown prosecutors on this right now. This letter just came out. It was written on September 14th, though, okay, several weeks ago. It's signed by your Attorney General for Ontario, your Minister of Children and Youth Services, your Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services. This is the letter signed by the 3 ministers of government for your province. They write, "Dear Mr. Buckmaster, CEO of Craigslist, we also understand that in response to concerns recently raised by a number of US state attorney generals, Craigslist has continued a series of substantive measures by shutting down links to adult services and related ads. We applaud Craigslist, while we applaud Craigslist for the conscientiousness of this response to the request for assistance from our American colleagues, it has come to our attention that at present, none of these initiatives have been taken with Craigslist sites serving Canada. We respectfully ask that Craigslist immediately take the same initiatives with its sites serving Ontario." This is leadership on this issue. Okay? It's the first provincial government to stand up to Craigslist publicly now, releasing the letter today after we've been calling on them to do it since 5 a.m. is when I did the first interview today. Okay? So I applaud the Premier for taking this step. What I want to know is how Craigslist is continuing to stand up and say in a U.S. congressional committee under oath just a day after this letter was received by the company that they had had no request by a Canadian authority to shut down their erotic services site. That's the question we're going to be putting to congressional leaders. It's a pretty serious thing to mislead a congressional committee. This letter was sent the day before testimony was given in Craigslist. Now, what have they said in response to this? Well, a media story just came out in Post Media. While the Ontario government says they got no response, it was ignored, much like a similar letter sent by the BC Solicitor General last year. Craigslist claims that they've responded and that they're just going to continue going about their business. We're working right now to try to get other provinces on board. I've been in discussions tonight with the BC and Alberta governments as well as the Manitoba governments through a number of people who are working on this issue in a number of capacities. And we're hoping they're going to come on board and that by the end of next week, you're going to just see a groundswell of support. We're starting a list of organizations who are calling for the erotic services section to get shut down because there's simply no way to regulate it. It's a wild west. For some time I thought this was a good tool for law enforcement. When they shut it down in the US, I was initially opposed to that. I thought, well, but the police are rescuing people through this. It was only after talking to some people in the United States who have worked on the issue for a very long time, where they have entire task forces of the FBI. One task force had over 500 officers working at one time. If they put that much resources into this and they can't make the most use of this law enforcement tool, they saw that what they were doing was a drop in the bucket. How are we, with the most effective vice unit in the country, has just 4 officers, frontline officers in Peel Region. And they're responsible for not just this issue, but many others, and Pearson Airport, thank you very much. Okay. So if we can't put in the resources that the United States did, and they were unable to deal with this as a tool of law enforcement, I can't see how we could in Canada. That's the solution, is shutting the thing down. If Craigslist, and this is the last point I'll make on this, you can see I get fired up about interviews like that one. If Craigslist had a website section which said drugs, okay, or we'll make it better, it's erotic services, okay, hallucinogenic services, okay, and they use terms not like they do on these websites, barely legal, new in Canada, fresh, these are the terms used. Instead they said blow, snuff, crack, street names for drugs, and had prices and Google addresses and photos even, right? How fast do you think Craigslist's drugs section would be shut down? How fast? Oh, but it's mixed in with legal medicinal drugs too. We can't provide, shut them down too. Absolutely we can. When something has been infiltrated to that degree, there is no way to deal with it except to shut it down. Now, the basis of the concerns against Craigslist it's not about adult prostitution. Okay? It's about children who are being sold for sex. That is still a crime in this province. Okay? It hasn't been struck down. Child sex trafficking, and adult human trafficking. All those crimes continue to apply in this province, and all of them are being facilitated through Craigslist. All right, let's move off that point. How am I doing for time? Another few minutes here, and then we'll move to some discussion. Traffickers in Canada have a plan, but the government of Ontario, and indeed the federal government, don't. Some of you have read this excerpt from an instructional manual. Who's read this thing yet? You know what I'm talking about, the Traffickers Playbook. Has anyone got that far in the book yet? A few people, okay. I'm going to read it to you. I apologize that it's quite graphic. I included the excerpt in my book to show how organized and systematic these traffickers are. This is a recipe for exploitation. I've got a photo here of the front cover. You can't see it, but it's being sold on Amazon.com. Wouldn't it be a shame if they sold more copies of this book than the one that we're talking about tonight? You can even get a Kindle edition of this thing. Can you believe? So I didn't just surf the internet and find this. This was given to me by police officers who referred me to the manual saying, this is being used by traffickers in Canada to train each other. And I was given the same manual when I went to Washington, D.C. and met with leading anti-trafficking organizations there to say, how do your traffickers get so good at this? They referred me to the same passage. Here's the passage, and it's a whole book. This is just describing the process of grooming and controlling a victim, and I apologize for its graphic nature. It says, quote, you'll start to dress her, think for her, own her. If you and your victim are sexually active, slow it down. After sex, take her shopping for one item. Hair and or nails is fine. She'll develop a feeling of accomplishment. The shopping after a month will be replaced with cash. The lovemaking turns into raw sex. She'll start to crave the intimacy and be willing to get back into your good graces. After you have broken her spirit, she has no sense of self-value. Now, pimp, put a price tag on the item you have manufactured. When I heard about this, I knew we were in big trouble. This was published in 1998. It's being used. We still don't have a national action plan in Canada to combat human trafficking, and as a result, traffickers are operating across provincial borders, victims are being moved without police knowing about it, and victims who do come forward are paying the price. One of the major goals of our national public awareness campaign is to have the federal government announce a national action plan to combat human trafficking. I set out in detail what that plan should look like and what it should include. So I won't get into that now. I want to talk in the very last few minutes I have about this province in Ontario. Ontario is home to it's the largest province of destination for foreign human trafficking victims. Fully 46% of all human trafficking victims identified to Immigration Canada were found here in Ontario. Street gangs and violent criminal networks are trafficking Canadian and underage girls throughout this province and to other provinces. Unlike British Columbia, which has an office to combat trafficking in persons to help victims, Ontario has no such program. Unlike Alberta, which funds the Action Coalition on Trafficking in Persons to provide case management, helping these survivors navigate the bureaucracy of things like EI, getting English training, finding accommodations. Unlike that program in Alberta, there's nothing like that in Ontario. And the costs have been paid by victims. One case from 2008 involved several women from Eastern Europe escaping a sex trafficking ring where they were being sold as escorts. They finally made it to Pearson Airport. Their only wish was to go home. They were believed. This isn't a case where they were disbelieved. They were believed by the authorities that they were trafficking victims. Instead of providing them with a safe room, a safe bed, which organizations in the room I know from having talked to you have available and would love to have provided, instead of that being the final point of departure when leaving Canada, it was an immigration detention center. They were locked up. That's the consequence of not having an action plan. Tomorrow in Quebec, I'm going to be sharing for the very first time the story of an 11-year-old child trafficking victim who spent 1 month in segregated detention in immigration because that province does not have a provincial plan in place. An 11-year-old child, segregated, victim. Under US law, it is illegal to put a trafficking survivor in accommodations that are not sufficient with their status as a victim. That's a response we need to have here in Canada as well. So the first thing that I've called on the Ontario government to do is to create a provincially mandated body to coordinate services for trafficking victims, both foreign women and men and children as well as Canadians. These are just a few quotes from police officers I interviewed about what the provincial government was doing to help victims. Detective Sergeant Mike Hamill of the Toronto Police says, "I don't think anything's been done." Detective Wendy Lever says, "We have very little infrastructure in place that would make it easy or give that victim the confidence to call the police. We just don't seem to have the resources." And Constable Christine Arnold, who's one of my heroes and someone who introduced me to this problem and its systematic nature from the Peel Regional Police, said, "We need money for clothes, for food. We had one girl from Alberta that our unit had to pay for out of petty cash because our women's shelters were full. I know for a fact that frequent flyer points had to be used to fly a Canadian girl who was abused to get her back home to Alberta. The only option being offered to her other than that frequent flyer points donated by members of the community was to get on a bus. To get on a bus. Make your way home." Victims of human trafficking deserve better. And their abuse ends when they escape or get rescued, not continuing when they escape and get rescued at the hands of an inadequate system. Now, I want to end with the good news. Some of the things that I'm starting to see across Canada have made me feel like there is some signs for hope. And it's happened because of the organizations that are continuing to work, often on a shoestring budget. In Manitoba, in Winnipeg, there's a safe house that you read about in the book called Honoring the Spirit of Our Little Sisters. It's a last stop for sexually exploited Aboriginal youth. They have just 6 beds. It's the only Aboriginal-run safe house in a province which is believed to be the Aboriginal capital of Canada based on the number of people who are of that descent who live there. This is a community where there have been, across the country, 500 missing and murdered Aboriginal women. Some of these are children. Some of them are friends of girls who I met who live in that safe house, who couldn't get a bed at night. This safe house has documented they've had to turn away over 100 Aboriginal girls who are wards of the province of Manitoba, some of them who had been in 67, one of them 67 other placements, because the traditional child protection system wasn't working for them. They wanted to go to a place with people who are from their own culture, to be with their elders, to get healing, and they were turned away. And we need to see that program expanded, because the girls who go through this program become leaders in their community. They go on and they take programs and classes in social work. I mentioned that. It's a common theme. It's remarkable how many people who are survivors who go on to help others. We have a number of people like that in the room tonight, and a few who couldn't be here. People like Natasha Foley. Some of you know her and her work. People like Tamea Nagy. In Cambodia, it's people like Samali Mam, the Cambodian survivor who started that recovery center. There are heroes working to combat human trafficking. I've got a whole index in the book of those people. They need your support. Alan said that we decided to donate a portion of the proceeds of the book right away to organizations that are working who need help. I sent out an email to a number of organizations that I interviewed, including Honoring the Spirit of Our Little Sisters. And they said, we have 2 girls who are turning 18 in August. I sent them the email a few months ago. And they said they are terrified to turn 18 because they're going to be out on the streets again. They get a small check from the government, and that's it. All of you who bought a book tonight, or you're going to, I wouldn't say a huge amount because not much trickles down to this, but you have already helped. We gave grants of $1,000 each, administered by the Safe House, for each of these 2 girls who just turned 18 to get set up in their first home. And I'm gonna get a chance to meet some of them. I didn't think I would. They sent, my mom always said when you get a gift, you send a thank you letter, right? Well, they did that. It was this handwritten note from these young women who are moving on with their lives, and they told me what they were spending that money on. Microwaves. How many of you have kids who've moved out of the house and you helped out? You know what I'm talking about. Towels. I ate frozen chicken burgers for like 3 months when I was a student here, okay? People moving out on their first time, and especially someone in that situation, need our help. And at least these 2 young girls who are turning 18, who've lived to the age of 18. In this industry, this exploitation industry is a huge deal, and they're now getting help. The final thing I'll mention is this other young girl at that safe house. She's 13 years old. She's in Honoring the Spirit of Our Little Sisters, and her only dream was to find some way to pass the time. What she wanted to do is play basketball, but they couldn't afford shoes for her. So we donated a couple $100, got her a pair of shoes, got her a basketball, got her an outfit, and she's playing intramural basketball now in Winnipeg. Okay? Instead of being sold for men on the streets of that city, where girls who usually are there are at risk of being found on the outskirts of town. Okay? So if these survivors can move on, if we can put funds and volunteer time into these organizations, and all of the ones in the book I know and I've worked with and I vouch for them as great organizations, these people need our help. Okay? These are the heroes combating human trafficking. Okay? We need to support our police officers who are going undercover, who are putting their necks on the line. We need to fight back in the media, speaking out about what we know, about the reality of the majority, the vast majority of people exploited in the sex trade, and to ensure that those who you've elected, the privilege to represent you here in Toronto and in Ottawa, hear from you. Because I can tell you, having worked in government, that the only thing that gets attention, other than bad press, which we're working on, is calls, emails, faxes, handwritten letters. That's what gets attention. Okay. So you all have the power now. You've been informed about this problem. And now you've got the burden as well to do everything you can to contribute to it. And you've already done that tonight. So I want to thank you for coming. I'll pass it over back to Sandra, and I'd love to hear your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. That was a very informative and engaging presentation. When I hear you speak, I'm always so moved how you take something that's such a horrible crime and really inspire action and inspire hope. So we now have an opportunity to hear from you, the audience. We have a microphone, and Marco is going to walk up and down the aisle. So please raise your hand if you have a question. We actually have a first question out in the front.
Question up here? Okay.
Hello. Hello. My name... Hello. Is it still going? My name is Alice Proper. I teach sociology at York University and about sex trafficking. I am wondering if you could comment on the demand side. I know that in some of your talks you've been advocating the Swedish system, which regards the prostitutes as victims and charges and prosecutes the men. So my question about that is this kind of a law that's trying to change people's minds, or do they really act on it? Mm-hmm. Do they actually charge people? Do they convict people? And if they do, what are the sentences like? Mm-hmm. And then, I think one of the things that's, that could be sort of troubling is that there are many people who are saying that this is a normal phenomena, that men who are on trips need to do this, that the Johns are really good guys. And one of the people who gets on CBC an awful lot about this is, I believe his name is Chris Atchison from Simon Fraser University, claims to have interviewed over 1,000 men.
John Lohman's another usual suspect who speaks out on that too. Yeah.
And just on the CBC excerpts, I haven't read the study. Mm-hmm. Well, for one thing, it seems to me impossible that he actually interviewed all that many people and has a job teaching. And I wonder if you could comment, if you know more about that particular study. Thank you.
Absolutely. As I mentioned in my talk, this crime would not exist without demand. That actually goes for both sex trafficking and forced labor trafficking. Just on that last point briefly, California just passed a new law that any company over $100 million in revenue has to have policies that audit its supply chain for forced labor. Okay, so that's another side of this. On this demand for sex trafficking, I come out very strongly recommending that Canada adopt the approach Sweden has taken to addressing demand. The status quo in Canada creates criminal acts of people who I believe are exploited, many of whom are exploited. Okay? If you're found in a common body house, as a trafficking victim even, you're committing a crime. Okay? So the current approach does not work. If there's anything positive, and I don't think there's much, but if there's anything positive that comes out of the decision of the Ontario Superior Court to strike down 3 prostitution-related crimes, it's that it spurred a national debate about what our approach to prostitution and sex trafficking should be. Now, what Sweden has done, and we have a whole section in the book on the evidence related to it, just for those who haven't seen it yet, is to criminalize the purchasers. Okay? It recognizes that you can't separate prostitution from violence against women. It's not the law that harms people who are being sold for sex, it's the men who harm them. So it holds them responsible. Now, Sweden has a combination of what we would in Canada call John schools. There they call them caste groups, to try to change the attitudes of purchasers. But they also have fines and imprisonment. Okay? Now, the number of individuals who've been brought through this system, I believe, was around 500. It's quite a small number, actually. But a recent parliamentary inquiry by a judge recommended they double the maximum penalty from 6 months to a year. Now, the key to this is the other side. What about those being sold? Well, it's not a crime for those people. They're not treated as criminals in Sweden. Instead, Sweden put, and this is the key people often don't notice, $32 million Canadian into a national action plan, providing things like detox facilities for people who are exploited in the sex trade and are in there still because of substance abuse. Help them out, right? International research says between 85 and 95% of people sold for sex want out but don't see any option available. So that study which just came out, I think is really quite significant because it shows not only the public attitude shift, as you mentioned, but it's caused street-level prostitution to drop, and it has not caused indoor prostitution to increase at anywhere near the rates it has in neighboring countries like Norway, who at the time had more liberal laws regarding prostitution. So the Swedish approach seems to be really picking up some steam. The Standing Committee on the Status of Women in Ottawa recommended that Canada adopt it in 2007. And unfortunately, Madam Justice Himmel, who was the judge who struck down the 3 prostitution-related laws, dismissed all the expert evidence about human trafficking as incidental to the case. I think that's a serious error. I hope she's overturned on that point by the Ontario Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court of Canada. And the reason for that is it's not incidental. Even countries that have legalized prostitution, like New Zealand, have said that there's an inextricable, close connection between prostitution and the issue of sex trafficking. Now, on these questions about studies about Johns, and these studies that are really sort of apologizing for these men, we looked at a whole cross-section of research. So we did a really extensive literature review involving both Canadian and US research. The US research is a bit more extensive. And what we found is that men who pay for sex are the average man. The chapter title is accurate. The average John is the average Joe. They include people who, including Judge Ramsey, who was a judge in Prince George, preyed on Aboriginal girls, and you can read about what he did in the book. If a judge who later was sitting in judgment of the custody of some of these victims' children, knowing full well that he participated in putting them in that position, if he can be a John, anyone can. And in Quebec, they know this very well. A case called Operation Scorpion really blew the lid off. The problem with these studies, like the one that you mentioned, is that they involve self-reporting. So they ask Johns why they've done it. Did they ever commit violence? So you're asking a John whether he raped someone. Okay? You have to have very, very sophisticated research methodology to get legitimate information from those. So most of the research criticizing studies like the one you mentioned find that they're not very credible. And at that, the bottom line is that in our view, men in Canada who've paid for these sex acts with children or trafficking victims, they either don't know or they don't care. Okay? Thousands of Canadian men paid to sexually abuse those victims in the Nikpangi case. Clearly underage and under the control of a violent trafficker. They had no problem paying for sex with those people. Okay? So you often hear this thing, well, the men will report it, or other women in prostitution will report it. That turns out to not happen. We had a very few cases where that ever took place. So I hope that answers your question, but I'm happy to follow up a bit more on it later. Other questions? I think we have time for a few more. Yeah, I'll just let Marco come around.
Hi. I just wanted to say I was really interested in what you said about Vancouver also sending a letter to Craigslist to try to get them to stop. Because recently I looked on the Vancouver tourism website because I was interested in a trip, and I saw a whole section on the adult entertainment industry. Wow. And they said, like, yeah, adult entertainment services, if you want some, go here. And I was like, that's interesting that the municipal government can be advertising that to Johns, and then at the same hand say, shame on you, Craigslist. Do you have any comments on that, I guess? Yeah,
well, I haven't seen that section. If you can email that to me, I'm going to be in Vancouver on Monday, and I'd love to pound the pavement on that one. So quite seriously, if you can email it to me. This is how I work, by the way. I don't know if you noticed this. I just kind of call it like it is, because unfortunately there's not enough people who do that. And a lot of people who would say the exact same things I'm saying, who are in government, I get calls from all the time saying, thank goodness you're saying it, because we can't. We've been saying it behind closed doors. So let's get that information public. It's certainly a problem which I think is raised often, that we are promoting this through licensing escorts, licensing massage parlors, those community magazines. People say, what about those, Ben? If there were 3 of me, we'd be talking about Now Magazine here as well. Okay? If you talk to the Toronto Star did an investigative report into some of these escort agencies and found they were controlled by a very small number of people. Right? The Toronto police detectives I spoke with said, do you really think, flipping through all those pages of all of those ads, of all of those women, that all of these people came to Canada, they can leave at a moment's notice and walk out of this? They don't believe it for a second. I don't either. Okay. So we really have to take the blinders off, and I think it's time to start calling a spade a spade. And I've started calling out municipal governments as well. If they're going to collect tax revenue through licensing what are called sexually oriented businesses, then they owe a due diligence obligation to follow up on those businesses. Okay? I wonder if the president of Now Magazine, if she's willing to let her husband call these and go get a massage. I say kind of, people are like, ha ha ha. Yeah. If we really all know what these things are, then surely we have an obligation, at least if we can all agree that you shouldn't have children in there, okay? Everyone should at least agree on that. And there are people who disagree about whether anyone can ever consent to this sort of activity, and that's sort of a separate debate, and one that I have in the book. I don't believe there is such a thing as a widespread group of people who are choosing this. Terry Bedford, who some of you have seen, who is the lead applicant in the case in Ontario, striking down the laws against prostitution, her response in the media when she found out that they'd struck down the laws, she's a 50-year-old dominatrix, according to the press, was, "I'm going to spank some ass." That was her response, okay? This is the informed debate we're having now about the law. She's someone who, whenever I do a TV interview now, the media puts her up on this pedestal and says, points at her and said, "This is someone who chooses prostitution. Who are you to tell her not to do that?" Well, that's not the position that I'm in, okay? Incidentally, just for interest's sake, I did some research. I looked at the affidavits that were filed in that court case, and I was very sad to see what I found. But I think it's important for people to know that even this individual, who is put up as the poster person for legalizing prostitution in Canada, entered as a child. She was 16 years old. This is in her own words in her sworn affidavit. I don't say this to say kind of gotcha. It proves the point. She was similarly to some of these victims you heard before. She was in child protection. She'd been sexually and physically abused before that. And it was a 37-year-old drug dealer that got her involved in prostitution. Not a high school guidance counselor sitting down. Do you want to go to Ryerson or U of T, or do you want to do a trade, or do you want to be a stay-at-home mom? No, it was not some sort of choice like that. It was a 37-year-old drug dealer that got her involved. So I say very strongly at the end of this book that it really takes truth to end this sort of oppression. I can tell you when William Wilberforce, who Alan mentioned earlier, brought forward evidence about the problem of slavery, he was met with lies, justifications, excuses. Okay? One of the pro-slavery leaflets, I provide an excerpt in the book. While Wilberforce was traveling Britain trying to abolish slavery in the 17 and 1800s, there were others out there saying, he's completely off his rocker, he's a moralist. They had evidence, they said, from slaves who claimed that the life in the New World was all roses and tea. They were told that they had, quote, a cozy garden with a bunch of chickens. Each slave had his own plot of land. They benefited from this deal. It took Wilberforce showing up in Parliament, literally laying the chains that had imprisoned slaves on ships before the lawmakers in the Westminster Parliament, showing diagrams, schematics of the ship. And any of you seen the movie Amazing Grace? Yeah, check it out. This is what they had to do, showing detailed descriptions of how the coffin-sized containers African slaves were shipped in to the New World. That's how they were transported, not on these cruise ships and luxury liners with long buffet lines. We've got similar things going on in Canada. We see municipal politicians going to strip clubs to be lobbied in the Greater Toronto Area, coming out saying, oh, everything looks fine to me. And this seems to sort of pass muster. Okay? So again, these lies will continue to be perpetrated unless people respond to them. And I can tell you that there's only so much that I can do. And so it really needs to come from you. And many of you are already doing this. I think we have time for just maybe one or two more questions. But, yep.
I believe in 2006 you did a report with a Future Group where you gave Canada a failing grade for human trafficking.
Yes. Has
that changed at all?
Have I regraded them?
Yeah.
Well, back then I wasn't a professor, now I am, so I guess I'm getting, grading is part of my job. I would say that there have been some real significant improvements. Someone asked me today on our press conference, do I think that the federal government will adopt a national action plan to end human trafficking? And I'm optimistic. And the reason I say that is there's only 2 times that I've ever personally spoke with the Prime Minister or through his office. The first time was through his office, the second was personally. And the first time was to ask him to do the right thing and bring temporary resident permits for foreign victims and give them access to health care. You can see there's kinks with that still, but dozens of victims have been able to get help through that program already. He acted on that within 2 months of that report. And the second was with Joyce Smith's private members bill. That came directly out of concerns from the Peel Police that we brought forward to Parliament. It's the only private members bill to become law since the 2008 federal election. It's the 15th time in the history of Canada the criminal code has been amended by a member of Parliament who's not sitting in cabinet. Okay? Those are the only 2 requests I made of the current government, and they took both of them. So this third one, we're going to push hard and strong, and ideally, we want this to be and remain to be a nonpartisan issue, and it should be. This isn't an issue of left and right, as I say, it's an issue of right and wrong. It's not an issue for cheap political points, but I know that certain political parties who make this an issue will only encourage others to do the same. So one of the things that we're working on right now is trying to create a nonpartisan anti-human trafficking caucus in Ottawa. You can see the same thing here in Ontario if you wanted to. All it takes is a chair from each party working together and say, we're going to come together and use our collective resources to advance ending this slavery in our country. We have time for another, maybe one more question?
We do have time for one more if there...
Hello, sir. What can the youth of today do to spread awareness on this important issue?
Sorry, could you just stand up so we can...
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
So what can the youth of today do to spread awareness on this important issue, and what can we do to take a stand?
Well, I actually find that I still get called youthful, although the gray hairs, as you can tell, are starting to quickly lose that label to describe me. I found that organizing student clubs on university campuses can raise huge amounts of money that you can donate to groups who are working, some of whom are here tonight. I'll give you an example. When we did the Future Group's fundraising dinner, when we first went to Cambodia, we thought we had to do a big public event, get lots of community leaders, raise some funds for a silent auction. Okay? We raised some money, but we also spent a lot of money on paying for dinners, right? And a lot of money on paying for venues and that sort of thing. Cost of raising the funds. The next year, we came up with a new idea. We said, why don't we get people at the end of the school year to come to a party? We arranged with a nightclub for them to get a free drink and a bus arranged to take them to and from campus. And we sold $10 tickets. In the end, 1,000 people bought tickets, and we raised $10,000 by holding a party. Okay? So what can young people do? Do what young people do. If they want to spend $10 on that, fair enough. Facebook, organizing campaigns online. Okay? We're starting through our website. Some of you saw it listed earlier, invisiblechange.ca. There's another website that goes to the same page, endmodernDaySlavery.ca. We've just posted online a petition calling on Craigslist to shut down its erotic services links in Canada. And that's our sort of campaign of the week. We didn't start it, someone else did, but we're getting on board. There are 9,200 people have already signed on board. The goal is to hit 10,000 by the end of next week. That's one way you can help. Okay? But I think donating your time, donating your money, hold an awareness-raising event. There's a couple of great documentaries. Hope for the Sold has a free documentary you can use. Avenue Zero is another documentary. Host a movie night. Talk about it. Brainstorm. Okay? These are great ways, and everyone has something to give. You're an artist. Donate one of your paintings at work for a silent auction. Right? You're a writer. Write an op-ed in your school paper. Okay? Direct people to the website in that top 10 list. Okay? So I think that's a really great note to end on. And I'm certainly going to stay here for as long as I can. I know many of you still want to get a copy of the book, say hello and that, so I'm going to stay around. I'm going to Montreal tonight. This is the start of a national public awareness campaign. It's going to reach 7 cities. 1,500 people in rooms just like this in total, and hopefully millions reach through the media. So thank you so much, and good night.